Hi, this is Diane Myers from Texas Women's University, and today we'll be talking about PBIS in the classroom, data collection. Let's start with a review of the 4 central elements of positive behavioral interventions and supports. First, we must have outcomes before we implement positive behavior interventions and supports. What do we want to accomplish? In class-wide PBIS, the outcomes that support social competence and academic achievement might be fewer students being sent to the office, an increase in students' time on task, an increase in grades or test scores for our students. Every decision that we make in a PBIS system is driven by data. Data supports all of our decision making, and it tells us if what we're doing is effective. In PBIS, we use evidence-based practices to support student behavior. All of the training that you're receiving in classroom management is in evidence-based practices like maximizing structure and teaching and reinforcing expectations. The systems that we have in PBIS support staff behavior. The way that this training is organized and systematically rolled out to you is part of the systems component of PBIS. Throughout all elements of PBIS, data drive the decisions that we make. We use data to improve our behavior supports, and we use data to evaluate the effectiveness of the supports that we have in place. Why data? For every element of class-wide PBIS that you implement, you should be thinking about the outcome that you want to achieve. The only way that you'll know if you've reached this outcome is by collecting data. Data collection is a vital part of any class-wide PBIS system. Teachers already collect some data in the classroom. Teachers collect data on grades, and teachers collect data on student attendance, among other things. Collecting data on student behavior can be challenging, but teachers need data to guide their decision-making process, and they need data to determine if what they're doing is effective. The first step in data collection is operationally defining the behavior on which we wish to take data. An operational definition provides us with an observable and measurable description of the behavior. It tells us exactly what the behavior looks like so we can ensure that our data are accurate. The kind of data we collect depends on the specific behavior of interest and the relevant dimension of that behavior. There are a number of possible dimensions of behavior, which include how often the behavior occurs, which we call frequency. We might be interested in how long a behavior lasts, which we call duration. We also might be interested in the time between the antecedent and the behavior actually beginning, which we call the latency. Many times, it's not the behavior itself that's inappropriate, it's the dimension of the behavior that's inappropriate. For example, asking to use the restroom is a normal student behavior. However, if students ask to use the restroom 6 or 7 times during a class period, that's a problem with the frequency of the behavior. If a student asks to use the restroom and then is gone for 20 to 30 minutes, that's a problem with the duration of that behavior. So sometimes we don't actually need to change or replace the behavior. We just need to shape the dimension of the behavior so it's more socially appropriate. We shape the behavior along the dimension of frequency or along the dimension of duration to make the behavior more socially acceptable and in line with our expectations. We may also be interested in collecting data on the antecedents and consequences that occur with our behaviors of interest. Taking data on antecedents and consequences can give us information about predictors and the possible function of an inappropriate behavior. If we know that each time we tell our class that they're going to be doing a writing assignment and we have one student who gets angry and throws his pencil and rips up his work, we might approach the way that we inform that student about writing assignments differently. We may make sure that he has the information ahead of time. We might investigate if he has writing difficulties that are causing this frustration. We might scaffold his learning a little bit more to avoid this problem behavior. If we know that every time a student rips up his pencil and throws his book on the floor, we ask him to leave the classroom, we may actually be reinforcing that behavior by allowing him to escape an unpleasant task, and we should change the way that we respond to that behavior. Having information about antecedents and consequences can really help us design effective behavioral interventions. Let's talk about some of the dimensions of behavior that I just mentioned. The first is frequency, which is the number of times a behavior occurs. Frequency should be expressed in terms of rate. For example, if I tell you that a student was out of his seat 4 times, it makes a big difference if it was 4 times per minute or 4 times per day. We want to express frequency in terms of rate, which could be behaviors per minute, behaviors per hour, behaviors per day, behaviors per 30-minute period, as long as the metric for expressing the rate is consistent. That is, if we observe the student for 15 minutes one day and 25 minutes the next day, that doesn't make a difference as long as we are expressing our behavior in terms of behaviors per minute. The time period that you observe depends upon the behavior you are trying to document and where it occurs. You want to observe the behavior in the environment where it's most likely to happen. For example, if a student only displays the behavior in one classroom, you should observe in that classroom for at least 15 minutes if you can. 15 minutes is usually a good benchmark to give us a good idea of what's happening and may also give us some information on the antecedents and consequences of that behavior. If we're interested in self-initiated interactions with other students during lunch, we might observe a student in the lunchroom for at least 15 minutes. Another dimension in which we might be interested is duration. Remember, duration is defined as how long a behavior occurs. We use durational data when we're working with behaviors that have a clear beginning and a clear end and occur over a span of time. We simply start our stopwatch when the behavior begins, and we stop the stopwatch when the behavior ends. We might take durational data on something like on-task behavior, or maybe how long a student is out of his or her seat. Another dimension of behavior in which we might be interested is latency, and latency is defined as the length of time between an antecedent and the beginning of the behavior. We use latency data when working with behaviors that take too long to get started. For example, we might be interested in how long it takes students to line up after we give them a prompt to line up. Or we might be interested in how long it takes students to get out their materials after we tell them to get out their materials. To record latency data, we record the time between the antecedent that should trigger the behavior and the start of that behavior. For instance, we might say, "Okay, class, let's prepare to take a quiz." Start the stopwatch, and then as soon as students have all materials off their desk and their writing utensil ready, we stop the stopwatch. That gives us an idea of the latency of that behavior. There are several data collection tools available, and you can always create your own. You can go low-tech or high-tech. What matters most is that the data you collect are helpful to you for making decisions about your classroom management practices. Data collection should be efficient and useful. How you collect the data is up to you. Make sure that you select a method that is going to be efficient and effective for you and your students. Before implementing any intervention or practice, you should collect baseline data. Baseline data reflect a student's current level of functioning. For example, if we were planning to teach a social skills lesson on hand raising, we would want information about students' level of hand raising before we teach that lesson. So we would take some baseline data to see how often students were raising hands, do our social skills lesson, and then take data on how often students were raising their hands after that lesson to see if the lesson had been effective. We would know it was effective if we saw an increase in hand raising from our baseline data. Teachers should collect data regularly to ensure that their practices are having the desired effect and to see if they need to adjust any aspects of their classroom management systems. Also, teachers can take data on their own behaviors. Teachers may be interested in how frequently they are using praise statements, how often they're prompting students, or how many error corrections they're making during a given class period. There are a number of teacher behaviors that would be good subjects for data collection too. Let's look at an example of a sample data collection plan. In this data collection plan, the outcome is as follows. When finished with independent seat work, students will take out a book or another approved quiet activity during 8 out of 10 opportunities across the first marking period. Then, we have an operational definition of the behavior. After completing his or her independent seat work assignment, A student will put the assignment on the corner of his or her desk, take out a book or another approved quiet activity, for example, a crossword puzzle or word search from his or her desk or bag, and engage in the activity until the rest of the class is finished with the task. That is a very specific, observable, and measurable definition of that behavior. The data collection plan should also include examples and non-examples of the desired behavior. Here, examples include: student puts his assignment on the corner of his desk, reaches into his bag quietly, removes a book, and reads until his peers are finished. Another example: student puts her assignment on the corner of her desk, quietly opens her desk to take a word search out of her folder, quietly closes her desk, and works on the word search until her peers are finished. Non-examples of the behavior include student raising his hand and saying, "I'm done, what do you want me to do?" Or a student rustling loudly in his bag and then in his desk looking for an activity, or a student getting out of his seat to turn in an assignment and asking the teacher if he can use the computer. The data plan should also list the relevant dimensions of the behavior. Here, we're interested in the frequency, which we would convert into percentage by dividing the number of times the behavior occurs by the total number of opportunities for the behavior. For example, students take out a book or a quiet activity 12 times across 7 observed opportunities. We want to make note of the measurement system that we're going to use. In this data collection plan, it's a very low-tech measurement system. Tally marks on a post-it note or another data sheet. We talk about how we're going to summarize and graph the data. Here, we are entering data into an Excel spreadsheet. And finally, the plan should talk about how we're going to use data to make decisions. In this example, if data are below the desired goal of 80%, the teacher will reteach the expectation and increase the reinforcement for the desired behavior. If students meet the goal, the teacher will continue the current approach and collect data periodically to make sure that the behavior is maintained across time. Let's talk about what data collection can look like. You've been given an example of a few data collection tools that you can use. The top half of this page is a frequency monitoring data collection tool, which you would use to document how often a target behavior occurs. The bottom half of the page is a duration monitoring data collection tool, which you would use to document how long a behavior occurs. You could also use this duration monitoring tool to determine an average amount of time that a student engages in a specific behavior. Let's look more closely at data collection in class-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports. You can think about data collection in class-wide PBIS in terms of the areas that we discussed in our earlier modules. For instance, let's think about some student and teacher behaviors that would be relevant in maximizing structure. Let's think about some behaviors that are related to maximizing structure that would be appropriate targets for data collection. We might be interested in taking data on students' arrival routines, maybe how long it takes them to settle down once they enter the classroom in the morning. That would be an example of duration and latency recording. We might be interested in how long it takes students to get their materials together at the end of the day when it's time for dismissal. We may be interested in our own grading routines. Perhaps we want to take data on the duration of time we spend grading each day and try to increase or decrease that duration. We may also be interested in our own supervision patterns, and we could take data on how often we circle the classroom or the frequency of our interactions with students. There are several behaviors related to establishing and teaching expectations in which we might be interested in data collection. We might want to take data on students' knowledge of expectations. How frequently do they engage in behaviors that meet our expectations? We might be interested in collecting data on any expectations that we've taught to students. So after we teach a specific expectation and behavior, we would take data on the frequency or duration of that behavior. We might be interested in taking data on our own use of prompts and pre-corrects. How often are we prompting students to engage in appropriate behaviors? There are several behaviors related to actively engaging students in which we might be interested in taking data. For instance, we might want to collect frequency data on how often we give students opportunities to respond. We might want to collect frequency data on how often students participate in class. We may be interested in durational data on how long students are on task during class. We might want to collect data on our own use of varied instructional methods. We might want to collect durational data on how long we spend talking versus how long students are talking. There are several behaviors associated with reinforcement in which we might be interested in taking data, including our own use of praise statements. We might be interested in taking data on students' rate of earning reinforcement. We might be interested in something more specific, such as the student's rate of encouraging comments to one another during group contingencies. Finally, we want to think about some student and teacher behaviors that would be relevant for data collection when we think about how we respond to inappropriate behaviors. For example, teachers might want to take data on their rate of error correction. They may also be interested in data on students' rate of behavioral errors. Remember, when you're taking data on inappropriate behaviors, you're looking to see a decrease in those behaviors. For more information, you should refer to the Student Services Intranet website and consult with members of your campus PBIS team. Thank you.